But first, let's deal with the chapter 11. So I've been talking about this kind of stuff for a few weeks, this business of postmodernity or postmodernism. And the best way to think about it is as a reaction to or rejection of the project of modernity. So for our purposes, this is really about, this 300-400 year long odyssey that begins in the kind of late Renaissance, early modern period with the ascendance of scientific empiricism, this sort of attempt to understand the objective world using scientific measurements and the rigorous sort of application of rational methods to map and understand the external world. We see a related phenomenon happening in logic, thinking about the mind itself as this kind of rationally ordered machine. And if we just sort of use logic, we can kind of sift through any social question or problem or mystery or curiosity or controversy or whatever. We just sort of apply the dictates of reason and all will work out. I mean, that sort of bedrock assumption is characteristic of the modern era, the modern period going from, 17th to early 20th century. So when we think about modernity, we should think about the promises or the aspirations of modernity, and they entailed or they contain some basic premises that Herrick notes here. I just wrote down some notes. As mentioned, the first kind of major premise of the modern era is that science and reason can save us, or they will make our lives better. They will improve the conditions of life together. They will offer us, if we do it right and if we kind of go far enough, they will offer all the tools and resources and technologies and social management systems and theories and methods and so on that we would ever need in order to kind of get out of our darkness and our error and so on, right? So that was underneath everything. Related to that is this notion that the cosmos itself, right, universe itself, the earth, the laws of nature, the laws of our brains, our minds, that these followed a kind of rationally ordered model of some kind, right? Whether it's the mind of God or some kind of intelligent designer, but that there is an objective kind of rationally ordered reality to our existence. And so science and reason help us get at that, right? So the methodologies of science and logic are the ones that are best reflective of natural order. And so this idea that objective knowledge contains its own kind of truths that we must attempt to achieve. This is, again, that kind of correspondence theory that I talked about in a previous video. It might have been the Vico-Descartes one. The notion that, the world is ordered rationally. And so if we order our language rationally, and if we try to order our thoughts rationally, everything will nicely kind of correspond, and sort of that's how we achieve order, harmony, and progress, and so on, right? Related to this is this idea of the rational subject. I've sort of mentioned this already, but this idea that like humans themselves are innately rational. I don't know if you've ever heard, you probably have these sort of economic theories, like the Adam Smith, the invisible hand of the marketplace. Adam Smith actually lectured in Rhetoric. I haven't spent much time going through his Rhetoric lectures, but this is a guy who's like known to be the modern sort of founder of economic thought, this business of like the invisible hand of the marketplace, the idea being that if we all pursue our own rational interests individually, then everything will sort itself out in the kind of the general sense, and that's the invisible hand guiding us, making smarter and better decisions, right? So if we all just kind of enact our own rational inclinations, then everything will work out, right? And all of these things, as we will see, have been challenged, debunked, flipped over, flatly rejected in terms of that postmodern kind of response to all this stuff. But this is sort of like what we can think of as the modern, project. And so in a moment, Lyotard's going to talk about meta-narratives. And so these are some of the assumptions that were guiding sort of everything, guiding sort of industry, guiding politics, guiding, you know, understandings of social behavior and explanations, and guiding, you know, the theorists and the intellectuals and how they saw the world and wrote about it. And so these premises fall under some canopies. I think of meta-narratives as sort of like canopies that we sit under. And so we have these canopies of science and reason, and we have a canopy of like nationalism, nations, and sort of the belief in the inherent goodness of the nation and its, you know, and its inner logic of making life better for all. There's a canopy of progress, right? Through capitalism, through science, through technological advancements. Have you ever seen any of these old futuristic? I love this idea of like futuristically minded kind of fiction from the past, right? If you go back into the early parts of the 20th century and you see futuristic kind of text, sci-fi, or you go to these world exhibit kind of things where they were sort of planning what life will look like in the future, it was all extremely, extremely optimistic. And it was all like, you know, microwaves and ovens and refrigeration. These are the miracles of, you know, modern life and better living through chemistry and these kinds of things. All right. So that's all kind of that modern project. And then the postmodern moment is a moment of kind of like awakening from that and realizing that like maybe there aren't these kind of bedrock certainties underneath these canopies that we can just kind of rely on. And maybe science and technology aren't inherently liberating and order creating and so on. And so that's sort of in a broad sense kind of what we're dealing with. And we have some important theorists that start to kind of filter into the American academic context and then into rhetoric specifically in communication studies. And largely these are coming from France. A lot of really well-known French intellectuals, people like Lyotard and Derrida and Foucault, came up with these really bold statements about the kind of assumptions I had just mentioned and you know, devoted their careers to kind of unpacking those assumptions and troubling them in many ways. And these insights have really filtered into my world, you know, into the academy and the stuff that I read and the articles and the books and so on, and stuff that kind of trickles into the classroom. So, you know, here we are reading about this stuff. So we are definitely in a we're in a postmodern moment. I mean, if this started around mid-20th century, it really has colored and affected so much of how rhetorical theory and communication theory, social theory kind of in general, has taken shape in the decades since, right? And so the 1960s became a time of like wild disruption, socially speaking, where some of these theories were really starting to kind of get picked up by citizens, and you see student activism in the 60s, and you see feminism and black rights and gay and lesbian movements, and so all coming out of that time period. A lot of that was being driven by these kinds of writings and thinking about those assumptions that had been kind of carried forward, right? So, as Herrick notes here in the beginning of page 265, chapter 11, he's noting that in the mid-20th century, there's an increased attention to the relationship between language, culture, and power. That word power is one that we are now encountering for the first time, and it really sort of brings, you know, all of these other pieces together in this question of, you know, which languages, which ideas, which knowledges kind of exert control and force over parts of society and what's underneath that and how true is it versus how much is it just sort of exerting force, right? So power becomes important here. Language's role in shaping human thinking, human societies, and in the construction of our sense of self, interest in the inherently rhetorical nature of language, and so on, right? So language becomes a major focus of these theorists, of especially Derrida, but also Foucault and language in a very broad sense. Lyotard as well, and you know, these are three of the biggies. And so that's sort of like, you know, here are the rhetoric people, like Kenneth Burke had been theorizing the rhetorical power of all language, all symbolic discourse since the early part of the 20th century. And now these sort of French intellectuals are coming along and saying, yes, language basically mediates power. Language contains power within it, right? There is no such thing as neutral language. There's no such thing as sort of objective, sort of unbiased or unaffected language. And so we got to be thinking about the ways that language all over the place, whether it's scientific language, the language of industry, the language of, just sort of basic technical language, even the kind of language that goes into creating technologies, and even the technology themselves. I have a book that I grabbed from the office this weekend called Algorithms of Oppression. My research is getting interested in technology, and algorithms are really important for how, my goodness, how much we, spend our every day, especially now, online with our devices. And these things are governed by these algorithms that, that serve up certain kinds of information and filter other kind of stuff out, and that respond to our behaviors in certain ways. But these algorithms are not neutral, right? And they are coded by human beings that have certain biases. So this idea of algorithms of oppression is that even these technologies, which are made to seem as just perfectly rational instruments, in fact, can push us in ways that are sort of partial and affected and valenced and even troubling in some respects, right? And so it's deep. We're talking about some deep stuff here. It's really the kind of the structures of our everyday existence, and this is why it's sort of like some of this stuff's a little unsettling, because it's really getting at bedrock assumptions about the language of religion, the language of science, the language of our economics, basic assumptions, and so on. It's all the way to the bottom. It's rhetorical in the sense that it's sort of fictional. It's invented by humans. It's imperfect, and nevertheless, it continues to kind of govern how we think and behave. Right. So, the stakes are pretty high here in terms of how we sort out, what these ideas are, where they're taking us, and what the implications are. So, page 266, postmodern rhetoric. I covered all this. The hallmarks of all modernity include belief in fixed meaning of symbols, right? That's the idea of the correspondence theory of language. Symbols are fixed, and they just mediate the world in a neutral way. Trust in sense perception and direct observation. That's, again, that kind of the rational subject that corresponds with an objective world that's also rational. And the authority of the individual human subject pursuing truth, right? Rational subject. Progress, the rational project of delivering humanity from the oppression of what they took to be superstitions and false beliefs, right? Coming out of a period of darkness, right? It makes some good sense that when this thing called science and rationality was discovered, and it was imbued with this hope of order and harmony and justice and so on. It's let's go there hard, right? But what you find when you study history is that when humanity discovers something, it goes really hard in that direction, and then it tends to go really hard in the opposite direction, which is what the postmodernists do. So I'll be sort of noting some points where it's that seems a little maybe overstated, right? But the postmodern reaction takes the assumptions of the modern project and really kind of beats the hell out of them, and in a way where it's does it go that far in the other direction, or is there somewhere maybe in the middle here? This business of the taken for granted, right? So 266 at the bottom there, this business of what we consider to be normal, what we consider to be just a basic assumption about how the world works, right? That again, if human rational subjects just pursue their own economic interests, everything will work out. Giving something over to the market, right? That's going to save us because people just pursue their own rational interests. This trend really kicked in hard in the sort of 70s and 80s, and I remember when I was an undergraduate in the 90s in Canada, there was this period of privatization, right? The idea being if the government in Canada actually used to own or control the liquor trade, the liquor industry. So if you wanted to buy beer or wine or booze or whatever, you'd have to go to a government building. But then this neoliberal privatization thing kicked in hard in the 90s and lots of privatization. And so the government said the market can do this better than we can, so we're just going to privatize the alcohol industry and let the private companies and the consumers kind of figure it out, right? And so there was this period of like privatization where the government's getting out of the business of sort of taking control over these different industries, because the assumption was, and you still hear this a lot today, the assumption is that the free market will solve all problems on its own, right? Because people pursuing their own rational interests will ultimately make the best decisions, collectively speaking. This has not always or even often proven to be true. There's a new wing of economics known as behavioral economics that has come into being specifically to better understand the failures of the rational consumer, right? And so if it for a very long time was assumed that the consumer was always making rational choices, always like cost-benefit analysis and so on, economists have finally discovered that like that's not actually how we work. We often make very irrational decisions, right? Economically speaking, we can do very dumb things with our money. Think about addiction, think about compulsion, think about gambling, right? It's like, where's the rational, so there's all kinds of behaviors that we engage in that are wildly irrational, that do not hook into that assumption of the rational economic actor or the rational subject. And so more and more, this is becoming the case of like, okay, maybe we're not actually rational actors. Maybe we're irrational actors, or we're sort of partially rational and partially irrational. So we're continually trying to learn more about how humans actually behave together. But this business of the taken for granted is something that's being reworked constantly. Is it taken for granted that technology is inherently good when we have all of these new weapons and new modes of killing ourselves, like guns and chemicals and nuclear bombs, and it gets scarier all the time. And now we're dealing with like cyborgs and robots and AI, and it's like, is this stuff inherently good? So the postmodernists were challenging all of these taken for granted, all of this stuff that just seemed normal and assumed. We'll talk about gender in a bit as well, but this idea of like, what even is a human, or what does it even mean to sort of be a man or a woman? All of these taken for granted are coming under critique. So Lyotard is really important here. He gives us this business of meta-narratives, these overarching explanatory systems, right? Narratives, social narratives, things that are so obvious that we don't really even question them so much. Right now we're in this pandemic situation, and I'm just sort of fascinated and a little nervous about a lot of the conversation right now about like what does normal even mean anymore? Like, what's life gonna look like on the other side of this? Like, will cruises still exist? Will restaurants exist? Right? Will cars exist? Like, all of these sort of taken for granted are getting kicked up and questioned. And a lot of the postmodern types would say, yes, good, right? Like, now is the time where we can finally really, really ask hard questions about whether or not we want to continue to live our lives this way. A lot of people who maybe hold on to those more modernist assumptions are seeing like, oh my goodness, we gotta get back to normal. We gotta kind of hold on to the way things are. So we're in this moment of like ambivalence, wild ambivalence, and open-endedness. Like, where are things going to go, and how are they going to land? It's not mentioned in here, but Lyotard came up with this idea of language games. So if the idea that language is not neutral, even the language of science, as we saw with Fisher last week, the language of science, the discourse of science isn't neutral. It doesn't just mediate perfect objective knowledge, right? That leads to this idea that in any given sort of usage of language, we will find partiality, we will find bias, we will find subjectivism, and so on. So we need to think about language differently, not as something that mediates universal truth or objective reality, but as maybe more like a game that we play. Game in the sense that like there are certain kind of implicit or explicit rules. There are certain participants, and it's bounded in a certain kind of location or specificity, right? And so you can think of like the language game of academia. You can think of the language game of the marketplace, the language game of the legal system, right? It's not to say that it's a game in the sense that it's just for fun and it doesn't mean anything, but it's something that we have invented and that we participated in a very particular way. And it leaves open the idea that, like, as a game, you can kind of adapt the rules, change the rules, like, as you need to, right? I think it's an important idea, and I think it's a pretty good way of thinking about how language operates. I would like, I like the idea of language as sort of tools, but also tools that operate in very specific kinds of contexts and maybe not other kinds of contexts. This is also setting up the Foss and Griffin piece on patriarchal rhetoric and feminist rhetoric. And as I'm going to propose, like, maybe we think of those as different kinds of language games in and of themselves, in terms of, like, in some situations it's better or more necessary to be patriarchal, but in other situations maybe it's better to be feminist in orientation and invitational and so on. In any case, good, structuralism, Levi-Strauss, yeah. So this is postmodernism is also referred to as post-structuralism, and that's kind of a response to the kind of assumptions that we see in Levi-Strauss, this idea that, like, all human cultures, all human societies are governed by these implicit structures, myth-making structures, and they structure our knowledge and our thought and our behavior and our language, and they kind of, like, sort of operate outward. Postmodernism is a rejection of that idea that there's a kind of universal fundamental structure system to how societies and cultures organize themselves. The top of 268, the order of the mind expresses through myth may reflect a cosmic order, right? So this idea that structures, thought about, like, Levi-Strauss is like an anthropologist, right? And so it's like you go into any different culture across the planet and you're going to find these repetitious kinds of structures in terms of narratives and myths, and that reflects this larger cosmic order. That's the correspondence theory, essentially. And so the postmodernists were responding and rejecting that idea. 25 already, my goodness. So Foucault. Foucault was the guy I was going to try and get a little sampling of. I just said forget it. All right, so Foucault is really present and relevant today, and a lot of the discourse of the left, the progressives of the left, have extended a lot of his insights on power and knowledge and language and the constructedness of our sense of right and true and normal, right? So this the relationship between discourse, knowledge, and power, right? So basically what we can think of as true in any given moment is an effect of discourse, and discourse mediates power, essentially, right? So, this idea that knowledge is power, it doesn't mean that more knowledge gives you more power. It's sort of the opposite, is that all knowledge is an effect of power, right? It's like the slogan of postmodernism works well here, which is truth is one. Not one, but one with a W. Truth is one. Truths are things that we sort of battle over. And certain actors or certain, sectors of society will gain more truth. Even in the academy, I'm part of the academy. I'm a critical humanistic scholar, right? And so the truth of the academy is the kind of work that I do is not terribly relevant and not terribly valuable in a kind of market sense. Whereas the people who are doing engineering and science and the STEM fields, that's the true value, because out of that we get drones and we get big data sets and so on. And so, like, the truth of that sort of academy is, like, the money goes to the STEM fields, and we're just sort of like left to think about questions about human values and so on. And it's sort of like, it's nice, but where's the real value? And so who gets to decide that, right? It's a kind of a contest over ideas and a contest over terminology, and that's Foucault. And I want to talk about archaeology knowledge. Excluded discourse is related to what I just mentioned. So if truth is one, it can also be lost. And if to the extent that a truth is lost, you can think of it as an excluded discourse. Think about the things that are just not really acceptable. I don't know if you guys remember the Democratic debates, trying to come up with a nominee. We obviously know it's Biden now, but for a time there was a whole bunch of people. Remember Marianne Moore? Was it Marianne Moore? And she was saying all these things, and it was about, like, the soul of America, and she was talking what a lot of people were like, oh, where's your crystals? It's like, she was kind of a joke. She was made to seem a joke on the stage, but and you can use Foucault here to maybe think about, like, what counts as more reasonable on the stage there, and what counts as unreasonable or excluded, right? And there's these kind of like implicit assumptions and codes of like what determines one or the other. Queer theory is extending out of not just Foucault, but Foucault was sort of important in the early phases of, he wrote three books on the discourse of human sexuality, and, you know, these ideas of like the givens, right? So the givens of like what it means to be a human sexual creature or a gendered creature, right? It's like he was challenging a lot of that stuff. If these ideas are one, right, then they can be presumably thought about differently. And this is a kind of moment that we're in right now, as I'm sure everyone's familiar, that, you know, what does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to have a gender? Does gender even exist at all? And what's the point of it, right? We're in this kind of sort of social moment of challenging and critiquing a lot of those assumptions. And Foucault was one who got that ball rolling decades ago. So queer theory is not only about sexuality, it's largely about sort of that whole business of what's normal and challenging our very ideas about normality and normal behavior and what's right, being connected to what's normal. And queer theory wants to kind of play around with all these assumptions about the normal. All right, so Derrida next is another really important French theorist. He's known for deconstruction. Basically, the idea, the insight that he offers is the rhetoricity of all discourse, all language, meaning that all texts, as he would say, all, you know, written text, spoken texts, film text, documentary text, a newspaper text, these are all rhetorical all the way down in the sense that they are open. They're never closed. They're never, like, text is never sort of perfectly self-contained. Because language is this signifying thing, and every term has more than one meaning, it sort of stands to reason that sentences, paragraphs, pages can be interpreted in many different ways, right? So language is always carrying with it more than in any given usage will like be aware of, right? So you write a poem, you mean it to sort of, or poem's too fluid. You write an essay and you mean it sort of to say these three things, but people come along and they misinterpret it or they interpret it differently, and it's like, right? So that lets you know that a text is open to interpretation because language is open, right? It's not closed. There aren't fixed, stable meanings. And so to the extent that a text is open, we are sort of vulnerable. As authors of texts and as speakers of text, we're vulnerable because the idea is that there's more that's kind of could be sneaking in. You know, even Freud kind of fits in here a little bit, right? We might be like, the idea of a Freudian slip is like, we're actually thinking about this, but we say this, or we say this, but we're, you know, it's like the sort of the opposite. So this idea that there's more below the surface of a text, that there's more in a text than we might think, even as the author of that text, is a really kind of interesting and troubling and complicated idea, because it opens up this like almost limitless possibility for what can be in a text, right? And so the deconstruction kind of effort was an effort to get at a text that maybe thought that it was closed and final and perfect and certain, and to demonstrate how in fact it's rhetorical in the sense that it's constructed and invented and imperfect and not in fact closed. And you can never pin down a text once and for all. The deconstructionists were all about kind of messing around with texts and troubling texts and showing how, like, just because someone believes in a text doesn't mean that there's not more in there that can be sort of pulled away from it or read into it and so on. And so there's a freeing aspect to that, right? Which is like, we're not bound by the Constitution. The Constitution's an open text, and we can think about it differently. We can use it in all kinds of different ways. But it's also troubling if you actually like a text and you like its boundedness and you do believe that it's solid and certain and grounded, because the deconstructionists love to come along and be like, nope, there's more to it. You didn't realize, right? So in anticipation of the Foss and Griffin essay, we can actually do a little bit of deconstruction on that essay, even in a text that is pushing against these kind of dominant patriarchal traditions. You can still do a kind of deconstructionist reading of that text, as I'll attempt to show. So meanings are unstable, texts are open and unstable. There's always more in there because there's also more going on below our conscious awareness too, right? So the business of the unconscious is very much at play here. The business of language's ability to say way more than anyone is sort of aware of its usage, right? It's like you say something, and it gets misinterpreted or it takes off in a different direction. It's like we're always kind of at the mercy of language, right? That's a very Foucauldian idea as well, this idea that we are, as subjects, just the effects of discourse. We're always just kind of like getting kind of realized through language games and through these kind of ongoing open-ended meanings and so on. You might see that as a good thing. You might see that as a troubling thing. I promise you both camps exist very much so. I'm just realizing I'm going to have to do 2 videos here. So I'll just do this one chapter in this video, and then I'll do a separate video for Foss, because it's hard to cover this in any kind of clear way. These ideas are a little complicated. So the rhetoricians were pretty happy about all this kind of stuff, because you have these really brilliant French intellectuals basically sort of discovering that language matters and language is powerful, and it's, you know, it's all inventional, right? And even scientific language is inventional, and even, you know, technical discourse is inventional. And it's like, hey, that's us. We're the rhetoric people. We're the ones who are hip to the inventional powers of language and meaning making and so on. So the postmodern moment and the kind of the critical turn in rhetoric are kind of lining up here, and these insights are coming into rhetoric and getting sort of picked up in very happy ways for the most part. Yeah, so this leads to Feminism and Rhetoric on page 275, Critique and Reform. Kind of stands to reason that if we are coming into this awareness that all knowledge is open and partial, and it's it's one in the sense of like battled over, and so that you have winners and losers, and if it stands to reason that language itself and language games are partial and filled with desire and human subjectivity, then eventually, you're going to start asking questions about your own bedrock assumptions in your own kind of area of language games. And so you think about rhetoric as itself a language game, going back to the Greeks. All of a sudden, in the middle to later parts of the 20th century, rhetorical scholars are saying, maybe rhetoric itself, maybe the assumptions of rhetoric itself are less than bedrock, right? So this business of rhetoric as persuasion or instrumental uses of language to kind of achieve certain outcomes starts to get really challenged. So in the 70s and 80s and 90s, there's a whole bunch of essays that were making this similar kind of argument that rhetoric as a tradition, as a field of study, is essentially a language game. And guess what? It was the men in power, right, sort of determining the rules of the game. And the rules of the game, as we'll see with Foss and Griffin next, are about, domination and wielding influence and sort of like overtaking the will of your audience and, sort of using the audience like objects to achieve certain outcomes. And so you have all these critical books and essays being written about, like, maybe rhetoric itself is an effect of power. Maybe rhetoric itself is just kind of creating patriarchal soldiers, essentially, in its teachings and its priorities and its values, right? And so here we have next a feminist rhetoric or an invitational rhetoric as an opportunity to kind of rethink some of those assumptions. So we'll see that next. Which is actually a pretty good place to start landing the plane here. The last major chunk of this chapter is on comparative rhetoric. And so, again, it makes perfect sense. If rhetoric itself is a particular kind of language game coming out of a particular kind of context, being kind of jealously guarded by a particular section of society, men, European men, certain kind of rationally minded European men, then maybe it's time to start kind of broadening our sort of landscape to think about what other kinds of rhetorics might exist and how rhetoric might be used differently. And so we start to think about this, and this comes from the work of George Kennedy, this business of comparative rhetorics, which is, well, what about non-Western, non-Greek and Roman, non-Western, non-European rhetorics? What about Native American rhetorics? Well, ancient Chinese rhetorics or Muslim rhetorics? And so he's going through and he's sort of pointing to the different possibilities within different cultures of thinking about rhetoric not just as sort of instrumental persuasion, but as poetic or as communal, as invitational potentially and so on. So the project of comparative rhetoric wants to be thinking very broadly about rhetoric in a very plural sense, right? It's like what other kinds of rhetorical practices might we consider or locate? To me, this raises a more preliminary question of, do we want to think about rhetoric as one thing or many things? And if it is one thing, George Kennedy himself wrote this really wild set of essays and I think book chapters and so on, where he's talking about rhetoric as this universal human kind of impulse. And he even sort of attaches it to it almost sounds Darwinian a little bit. It's like biological or evolutionary in the sense that humans are wired to want to kind of cooperate and solve problems and get things done. And rhetoric is this thing that emerges as we try to kind of accomplish things and manage problems together. And if that's the case, then sure enough, we're going to be able to find all different kinds of iterations of that wherever we look, globally speaking, right? And Kennedy seems to be someone who's like, okay, well, let's think about rhetoric in the broadest possible sense, culturally speaking, but he wants to kind of boil it all down to this fundamental kind of human energy. He even comes up with this idea called the rheme, R-H-E-M-E. He's like, we might even think about something like a rheme, think about meme, but like rheme, like rhetoric meme, as a basic unit of rhetorical energy, as some kind of human expenditure that we can track anywhere on the planet, despite the culture, despite the period of history. We can maybe point to that kind of a shared understanding of rhetoric. Which I suppose if you go deep enough down, you might actually be able to make an argument for a one notion of rhetoric that gives rise to a million kinds of different expressions across the planet. A lot of people are intrigued by this idea. Some people think he's a kook, right? But then, you might also think, no. There's some people who just say, no, rhetoric is just oral pleading, right? It's just speech making, it's deliberation, it's Aristotle and so on. If that's the case, then fine. Then you're dealing with a very, very tight, specific kind of social practice. And then anything else that falls outside of that, like the stuff at the end of this chapter, just wouldn't be considered rhetoric. I'm not sure what you might want to call it, right? So it raises this question of at bottom, what is rhetoric, right? Is it about instrumental domination? Is it about change? Is it about cooperation? Is it about harmony? Is it about poetics? Is it about liberation and resistance, right? So I'm not going to answer this. I'm not going to insist that we know this. My own kind of bias goes in the direction of I think that rhetoric speaks to something pretty basic in sort of human social engagement. Our attempts, I'm sort of a Kennedy, I guess, in this respect, that we do need to manage our social relations discursively. And so rhetoric can be thought of as those infinite attempts to sort of wield artistically our technologies, our words, and so on to achieve certain outcomes and to manage social differences and social uncertainties. I don't know if there's anything else out there that describes that energy the way that rhetoric does. So I'm happy to call it that. In any case, the debate sort of continues, and we are in this moment today of basically rhetorics all over the place, right? It's everywhere. It's deep. It's hidden. It's unconscious. It's in food. It's in technology. It's in bodies. It's in all kinds of language, wherever you find it, cultures and so on. It mediates power, right? It can be used as a force of domination to keep certain people kind of off to the side, but then those marginalized groups can also wield the different arts of resistance and fight back and so on. So we're in a moment of wild openness in terms of what rhetoric is and how it's thought of. And I need to shut up. It's 42 minutes already. So that's, I know it's a long video, but that's about as good as I can do in as quick as possible, as short a time as possible, trying to explain postmodernism and how it relates to rhetoric. And so we will now see a kind of example of this with the Foss and Griffin essays. So see you in the next one.